It's really important to know our history. We got to know where we came from. And when it comes to churches and church buildings, it's really important to understand the history as best we can understand it. It's really easy for us just to assume that the things that we experience today are the way that things always have been, and we may be missing the boat on something. One of the most consensus items in early Christianity was that the early church met primarily in homes. Here's a quote. "The view that the early Christians met almost always in church members' houses is one of the strongest consensus in New Testament and early Christian studies." That's a quote by Edward Adams in his book, The Earliest Christian Meeting Places. And the book acts in its first century setting that Gill and Gempf say recent archaeological evidence strongly suggests that for the first few hundred years of the church's existence, Christian groups gathered not in large purpose-built church buildings, but in domestic residences which could accommodate their needs. Now, if you think about being an early Christian and you're meeting in a home and you're thinking about the things that are available to you at that point in time, there are other places that are available to you. It may be that you have a workshop, a place of business that you have that has some space that you can bring the gathering into at your own convenience. That's totally reasonable. Now, the issue that we run into archaeologically is that it's really hard to prove a home church because they're just going about their daily life and the worship gathering in the same space. Most homes were more like insulae, which are like townhomes basically, or like multi-leveled apartments, which is kind of crazy to think about with like ancient architecture that they could construct these multi-level apartment complexes. And these were very, very small. They were very, very intimate. And you might have 10, 12, 15 people could possibly meet in one of these. And often what we hear people say is, oh, they had these large homes. These rich people had these homes and, 20, 30, 40, 50 people in Corinth were meeting in a home. That might well be pretty anachronistic on the most part, because how many super mega wealthy people are there in the early Christian assemblies? There are some people are actually mentioned in Paul's letters who were probably quite wealthy, but they're pretty few and far between, and they're not going to be able to accommodate huge gatherings, much less anything more than 30 people. So if you think about just the average ordinary person, they're meeting in average ordinary places. And you can't hardly reconstruct this archaeologically because you just find a home and a home is a home. Once those homes later on, we'll talk about, get converted into dedicated church space, there are some characteristics of the archaeological find that then allow you to say this was a church building that was constructed or in such and such year, or a home that was renovated into a church building around such and such year. We're going to talk more about that. I just want to up front just say that these homes were almost certainly, for the most part, quite small, very few people, and that the early church multiplied on a very rapid basis with this design, through this form, let's call it that. And I believe maybe that's providential because smaller groups are more transformative. The potential for transformation is present in smaller groups rather than like groups of 500, 1,000, 2,000. Not saying transformation doesn't happen in a large group. I'm just saying that smaller tends to be more intimate and more transformational. In Acts 2:42, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayer. And it talks about how they met daily in verse 46 in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts. So they're at the temple, large gathering, and they're in homes, small gathering, and they're doing this on a daily basis. Acts 5:42, day after day in temple courts and from house to house. They never stopped teaching and proclaiming the good news that Jesus is the Messiah. Once again, it's a house-to-house thing. They're meeting where they live. That makes absolute total sense. There's Acts 8, verse 3, that Saul began to destroy the church going from house to house. Same phrase as in Acts 5 when it talks about where they're meeting. And he's going from house to house, dragging off men and women and putting them in prison. Now, there's a little speculation on this one because it doesn't say they were meeting to gather for worship, but it does show that seems to me, it's speculation, that the church is home-based and that Saul, is going to the places where he would expect to find a gathering and being able to pull the people out. But Acts 12:12, when this had dawned on him, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying. A lot of scholarly consensus is that Mary's house was a regular place of gathering of Christians in the early church. And Peter knows to go there. He knows that's where gatherings seem to take place, and he goes there and he finds a gathering. How about Acts 16, verse 40? After Paul and Silas had come out of prison, they went to Lydia's house, where they met with the brothers and sisters and encouraged them, and then they left. This doesn't describe corporate worship. This doesn't describe worship gathering, but the church does seem to have begun with the Philippian jailer and Lydia within their own households, like the conversion of the jailer's entire household. That's part of their culture. Their cultural identity is wrapped up in their household structure, in their family tree. How about Acts 20? On the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, kept on talking until midnight. There were many lamps in the upstairs room. Remember the insulae? Upstairs rooms? That's how these things operated. And there's Eutychus who falls out, and Paul brings him back from the dead. So they're meeting in a home for a worship gathering to get apostolic teaching and for the breaking of bread, for communion. That's Acts 20, 7 through 12. Acts 20, verse 20, it says, "You know that I have not hesitated to preach anything that would be helpful to you, but have taught you publicly and from house to house." Reminds me a lot of temple courts and in homes. Same in Acts 5, same in Acts 2. There's public spaces and there's private spaces. And a lot of the gathering seems to have been in private spaces, which are homes, workshops, barns, places like that these were not dedicated worship spaces where they just sit vacant all week until the Sunday gathering, and then that makes no practical sense in the early church. In Acts 28, verse 30, the whole book of Acts ends with Paul in a house. Presumably people gathered there and worship, but it doesn't tell us that. So again, a little circumstantial. How about Paul's letters? 1 Corinthians 16:19, "The churches of the province of Asia send you greetings. Aquila and Priscilla greet you warmly in the Lord, and so does the church that meets at their house." Plain as can be. There are a number of other people here, now in Romans 16, who talks about home churches. So it talks in Romans 16, 3-5, again, Priscilla and Aquila, to greet the church that meets in their house. And verse 10, "Greet Apelles, whose fidelity to Christ has stood the test. Greet those who belong to the household of Aristobulus, and also of Narcissus." And then he talks about Gaius, whose home the whole church has enjoyed. Okay, so you have people who have churches meeting in their homes. You have Gaius, who the whole church. Why would you say the whole church? Why not just say the church? It sounds like in 16:23 of Romans that Gaius is probably a wealthy Christian. He has a larger home, and now you maybe have a network of house churches, but a number of home churches all meeting within his home under his roof. Colossians 4:15, "Give my greetings to the brothers and sisters at Laodicea and to Nympha and the church in her house." Okay, Philemon 2. "Also to Apphia, our sister, and Archippus, our fellow soldier, and to the church that meets in your home." Very clear. They're meeting in homes. They were meeting in private spaces. Now, there is one verse that people bring up to kind of counter this. It's 1 Corinthians 11:22. "Don't you have homes to eat and drink in? Why are you doing this in the church?" It could be they were meeting in a rented space for their gathering. Maybe it was so large that they needed something like that. But it misses the point that Paul is making here, which is if you're going to get drunk at communion and the rich are going to eat all the food and the poor and the slaves are going to go last and get nothing, don't make a disgrace of the gathering that way. Don't you have homes to eat and drink in? If you're going to act that way, don't make a fool of yourself. Don't make a fool of Christ in the gathering. Go home. Do that junk at home. He's not saying don't meet in a house. He's not saying don't eat in the gathering. He's just saying if you're going to act in the way I'm hearing you're acting, don't you have homes to eat and drink in as such? So that doesn't dispel anything about the meeting and the home. And then in James 2:2-4, actually uses the word synagogue as the gathering place. So suppose a man comes in wearing gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in filthy clothes comes in. And if you show special attention to the man wearing the fine clothes and say, "Here's a good seat for you," but to the poor man you say, "Stand there or sit here by my feet," have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? If a man comes into your meeting, the synagogue, he says, so are these Christians still meeting in synagogues? That's entirely possible. Paul went to synagogues. There was the 18 benedictions of the Jewish people where they added one some decades after this that cast the Christians out of the synagogue, which implies that Christians were meeting in synagogues. They were Jewish Christians. They're doing what they had always done. It's a little speculation on the synagogue connection with home church here, but this is from Bradley in Acts in the House Church, where he says, "A partial solution to the problem of securing a sufficient number of houses for the purpose of assembly can be found in contemporary Judaism. Most synagogues were single rooms and houses." Interesting. Did you know that most synagogues were single rooms and houses? Because the majority of the early believers were converts from Judaism, and coupled with the fact that the early community in Jerusalem included believers who were financially solvent, it would not be inconsistent to propose that some of the Jewish believers had formerly opened their houses or parts of their homes to the synagogue community. In turn, having espoused the Christian faith now, you've converted to Christianity in a sense, it would have been natural for these patrons to use the same facilities as a gathering place for the Christian community. So what he's saying is this was already happening in Judaism. These early Christians were largely Jewish in the beginning, and then it maybe makes some sense that this would transfer the home space into the church space, which it absolutely did. Then there's the church fathers, and this goes back fairly early, talking 2nd century, the 100s, 3rd century, the 200s. Around 165, you have Justin talking about meeting in a home. You have Tertullian shortly thereafter talking about gathering for communion in a supper room, which could be a home or a rented space. You have Clement of Alexandria around 200 AD talking about going to church. You know that Clement of Alexandria is the first person that we know of to use the phrase going to church? That's an interesting thing. But it wasn't until 222 to 235 with Emperor Severus that anything beyond a home church was kind of recognized in a more formal sense by the government, when he ruled that a church could be built during his reign, which ended in 235. So you're thinking that's 200 years of homes, 200 years of homes of exponential growth. Within 80 years of this, Constantine is going to have the Edict of Milan. That's going to institutionalize the church. That's going to end up in large dedicated space for worship. But until that point, the church was organic. The church was fluid, right? And very private. But it was 380, after the Edict of Milan in the early 300s, that Emperor Theodosius put the power of the emperor, if my understanding of this is correctly, under the authority of the church. And at that point, the church gained a lot of power. And that meant that the church was then able to kind of squelch or squash home church movements. And that goes all the way into the Reformation time, when home churches were persecuted because they were not part of the official establishment. And at first, in the early days, from the days of Paul until Constantine in the early 300s, 312, 315, something like that, the persecution came from the outside, like the pagan, idolatrous persecution of the emperor. But then after the church institutionalized and came under the umbrella of the Roman government, like the Roman Catholic Church kind of church, then, and I don't mean to be anachronistic or to project that in any way forwards or backwards, but my point is that once you institutionalized the church and formalized it and put the emperor in the mix of all that, even put the church above all those authority structures, then you had the authority within the church to say this is the official way, this is the only way, and to be able to persecute people outside of those structures. So we have that, and that's important to understand that. Home churches have undergone persecution for a really long time. I even see it. It's not persecution, so to speak, in our comments, but a lot of negativity toward home church in the comments on this channel about, it's right, it's all the abuse that takes place, and all the false teachers, and home churches are only people who just want to get their way and don't want to play by the rules and don't want to live under authority and all that. That has not been my experience at all. So a little more evidence here. How about some archaeological evidence? So the very first known dedicated church building is Dura Europa. This is in the year 230 to 240, around the same time as Severus. And they had taken an existing home and they had converted it into a dedicated worship space. They added a baptistry. They added windows to a room to get more light. They added some benches around the wall. They took out the latrine, so it does not seem like this is like livable, like weekly livable space anymore. And so they think this place could accommodate about 75 people, right? So think about that for a minute. Until 200 years post-Jesus, there are no dedicated church spaces that we know of. Certainly could have happened, but none that we know of. And the church exploded exponentially as everyday people use their gifts, local leadership, local elders, itinerant ministers, etc., apostles, went around teaching, keeping things in check, bringing accountability, etc. There's another example of an early church in the mid-200s at Megiddo. Peter's home in Capernaum seems to have been converted, if that tradition is correct, at least by the 5th century. So there are places in the Bible even that we know were not homes, like the Solomon's Temple, the portico in the temple in Acts 2 and Acts 5:12. We also have things like, historically, the catacombs sound like a place where Christians met from time to time. This is sometime later. But here's what I want us to get out of this, is that home churches are incredibly biblical. Home churches can be incredibly transformational, incredibly powerful, that the early church grew exponentially, even through times of persecution, through the home church format. And that doesn't mean that home church is a magic pill, that if you just swallow the magic pill, then everything falls in line and this amazing revival takes place and massive growth starts happening and mass baptisms are happening. It doesn't mean any of that, okay? It is what you do with it. But there is a tremendous transformational power in the home. So that's some of the history here. And it's rife with persecution, starting on the outside and then moving to the inside of all things. And I think that's really a shame, because when human institutions and organizations begin to take on authority and have authority structures, then they begin kind of stamping out the competition, and we can't see this as competition. So like our home church, we have a regular practice, more so when we first started than the last year or so, of like praying for traditional churches in our community. I personally pray for traditional churches in our community because it's all the kingdom. And there's not condemnation. This example is not prescription, but I do think it's worthwhile to examine the power of the intimacy and the power of the potential transformational nature of the small gathering. And this also works for small churches. You might be a church of 50 or 60 and you're like, oh, woe is us, we're not the church of 500 or 1,000. It's like we failed. No, you might be in an amazing prime position being a smaller church, to be about relationships, to be about edification, to be about transformation in that smaller gathering, that smaller space. I hope this gives you a little bit of context, both historically, archaeologically, patristic/church fathers, to wrap your mind around the church setting, church buildings, when they came about, why they didn't exist, and where we are today. And so use it wisely. If you have a building, use it wisely. There is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. God bless you. Be intentional, and let's all be accountable to the Lord on that. So I'm putting up another video on home church. I hope you'll take a minute to watch it. And by the way, many of you have asked if I've run into Tom Wadsworth's teaching. I connected with him in Ohio a couple weeks ago. We had several hours of great conversation. We did some co-teaching together, and we'll be talking a bit more about that soon. And so it was amazing that I had like 5 or 6 people reach out to me, and then here I find myself like at a conference speaking alongside him and having breakfast with him and all that, and tremendously edifying, as you can imagine if you followed Tom's work. But anyway, that's enough for now. Watch the other video. If you haven't liked and subscribed, do that now, and we'll talk again soon. Take care.